All right. All right, well, I'm gonna let you all get going. I could figure this out in a second because we are recording it, and luckily I can cut off the parts of me talking about YouTube. So I just want to welcome Harish again. He did a fantastic talk for us a few months ago, so it's been a while because of COVID-19. So I talked him into coming back for us because we had some talks scheduled and I didn't want to lose out on the opportunity. So I'm going to hand it over to you, let you do an introduction of yourself and go ahead and get started.
Sure. Thank you, Catherine, and I appreciate Suncoast Developer Guild for the opportunity to speak at your events, and it has been fantastic experience, and I always love to share information, knowledge, wisdom, and learnings and experiences. So this is one such opportunity to share about accessibility. And hello, everybody, and virtual handshakes to everyone. This is COVID safe. No issues with COVID here when we do virtual handshake. But welcome to this talk, and I would love to welcome your questions during the session. I don't feel distracted because I can come back right to the topic. So feel free to distract me. It's not a distraction. Okay. So my name is Harish Biram. I am a senior enterprise UI consultant at Agile Thought, working with some big enterprise clients, which are in the big 100, Fortune 100 companies. So been working there at Agile Thought for more than 3 years now, 3.5-ish years. And during this time, I have also got much more engaged with accessibility, not because of at the work related, because of the personal related things. So today's talk is about accessibility, and it is a nearest and dearest topic to me. It's because I am one of the low vision persons who is legally blind with 20 by 200 sight. So my best corrected vision is 20 by 200. However, there's a special case with my correction where they could do 20 by legal limit for driving is 20 by 70. So I fall under the 20 by 70 with something called bioptic driving. So a low vision doctor certifies me for driving. So people like me are one of the safest drivers because we are the ones who are driving at the 70 speed limit on the road, on the interstate. So we don't take risks. We don't, we keep enough distance because driving is a privilege for us. And we are in far less accidents compared to normal public because it's only known to me that driving was privileged when I lost my driving privileges during one of the sites, one of the visits to the DMV. And I was asked, you need to call your wife or somebody to take you back home because your license is right away revoked. And I thought for myself, why did this thing suddenly happen to me? And it's probably one of the reasons is me to expand my knowledge into accessibility and share this knowledge and experiences and skill set with people in the software engineering industry. And I am also trying to go back to other engineering realms of mechanical engineering and try to share accessibility over there as well with partnering with a university. And so that's one of the reasons why I call myself as accessibility UI UX evangelist rather than just a UI architect or UI developer consultant. So that's enough introduction on my side. Let me try to see my clicker if it is working. Okay, looks like my clicker is not working. Okay, so these are the statistics from the cdc.gov. Nothing is made up, and everything directly has been taken from the Center for Disease Control, which is one of the top organizations right now in United States, which has been governing the direction of United States right now, right? So their website has stated 61 million adults in United States have some level of disability. It could be minor to severe level of disabilities, and which are comprises of 26% of United States population. So that means 1 in 4 Americans has some level of disabilities. So there are different types of disabilities, right? There is mobility disability. We have seen people who are physically handicapped, who are on the wheelchairs. We have cerebral palsy and different other things, which are conditional disabilities and assisted living and vision disability, which mine falls under an impairment, but hearing disability and other things. So these are the ranges and the percentages from the CDC.gov. And it's in different demographics. It is not just in people, one sector of people, it's in every demographic. So senior citizens who are about 65 years, 2 out of 5 people have some level of disability. 1 in 4 women, right? 2 in 5 non-Hispanic American natives have disability. So what is accessibility? If we ask that question, it comes to a few different aspects. As we talked earlier, it is giving access to the products and services developed by software industry or any industry, mechanical, civil industry, which is construction of building materials, construction of buildings and railways, roadways, transportation services, libraries, any place, right? So it's giving access to people with all levels of disability. It could be cognitive, could be visual, it could be auditory, it could be motor or speech. So different variable disability ranges, right? So these could be disabilities, completely severe disabilities, or it could be low disability, which would make the person highly functional, but still have a significant impairment. That's what I use, for example, for my vision, I use magnifiers. So if you can see my screen, this is how I use my computer every day in and day out with a mouse pointer so big, and that helps me navigate the challenges in day-to-day life. I have a machine called eBot, which will allow me to put that under this machine. I can put a piece of paper which has a normal small font text, and that can zoom to 20 times or more than that, how much ever zoom I want. So again, I also have magnifiers that will help me navigate to the day-to-day challenges to see anything. So giving access to people with all different types of disabilities or impairments is called accessibility. So let's take an example of a building which has been constructed with stairs, right? And people have a person with disability entered that building, and he or she doesn't have an opportunity to climb the stairs because that person is on a wheelchair. So accessibility after the fact, that trying to provide an access after the fact looks ugly like this, whereas there could have been a ramp that was constructed at the beginning of the construction. So you can still go and retrofit a building with accessibility ramps, but it could not look as good as it should, and it could. So developing for accessibility not just helps a person on a wheelchair, but also it helps somebody who's bringing huge amount of luggage or big boxes of material to the building, right? It could help those people. It could help people who have kids or infants who are in wheelchair. and it could help senior citizens who are using different assistive technology to walk or move. And in certain emergency cases, it could help everybody because anybody could be in an emergency case. And in that emergency case, the paramedics can come and take that person from third floor or eighth floor of a building quickly back to the hospital. So when we think of accessibility, it is not just for, so in this case, only this 20% of the people where this accessibility ramp helped, but this 80% of the people are normal people who had an emergency condition or who have mobility needs, right? So, but it helps everybody, not just people with disabilities or impairments. So as we talked, it helps accessibility. When we design products and services, it helps all the people with disabilities and impairments, but also it helps by avoiding lawsuits and legal obligations that have to be met for people with disabilities need to be accessing the products and services that are publicly available on internet. And like Amazon is an e-commerce, and nowadays people cannot go to Walmart or other places like Publix. They have to rely on Amazon to send them groceries or goods and services. So if Amazon is not accessible, it is going to be challenging for them because there are lawsuits that are going to govern, which we are going to get into later, but it will help with this. And if you see the recent trend of the last probably 6 years, how it has been going from 2014 to now, it is growing, and it is growing at a fast pace. This is Americans with Disability, ADA, Americans with Disability Title III lawsuits. And these are in the federal courts, right? So these are the demand letters, and these are the lawsuits that are actually asking companies to move forward and do the accessibility needs for those products and services that they are offering. And it could also be the buildings, if a hotel or if it's a restaurant or some other place that is not accommodating physically handicapped people or something else like that are needed in the bathrooms where they don't have a rod for physically handicapped, that could also be a lawsuit. So making sure that people with disabilities can enter your businesses and can also benefit fairly like other normal people is a law. So keeping this trend in mind, it's better for your organization and the clients that you serve with your organization is to educate them with accessibility and how it should be taken care of. It also helps with search engine optimization. So when there is websites are ranked, relevancy ranking from Google, the websites that are both accessible and they are friendly for mobile friendly or tablet friendly, which is responsive web design, then the websites are going to be ranked a little higher compared to other websites that are not answering accessibility needs. Then accessibility is considered as a sub-discipline of usability. So when you talk to some of the user experience designers and architects, they say accessibility is part of usability, a sub-discipline of usability, and usability is a sub-discipline of the user experience design and the workflow of designing of any products and services, which I tend to disagree with it, but at this particular point, just remembering that accessibility is equally important like usability research and the design and navigation and other user interface structure that is needed. So it also makes the websites future-proof. So what happens is not only websites or your sites. So let's say your restaurant is having a ramp and it has in the bathrooms necessary needs to accommodate, and the doors are easy to navigate where you don't have obstacles. So you're making your business proof where there is no need for you to worry with lawsuits for accessibility. So that's pretty good to take care of it. So we've been talking about lawsuits, right? And what are those and what are the guidelines, right? So Section 508 is part of the Title III Americans with Disability Act. And this is the law governing for accessibility. And we are going to get into a little bit of details for that. And WCAG 2.1, let's forget about the version. About 2.1 is the version number, but WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So where they come from is World Wide Web Consortium, we all know, is governing the internet and standards across HTML and everything else. They have W3C, World Wide Web Consortium, has something called Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI. And this is kind of a project. And this project is an initiative where a group of people called Working Group have taken up the challenge of how to make it accessible, how to make internet accessible, web applications and mobile applications and everything accessible. And they have been formed as a group, like Web Accessibility Conformance Guidelines Group, WCAG Working Group. And their deliverable is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. So that means these guidelines that they have come up as kind of a de facto standard. And these standards, when are followed, they automatically pass your accessibility testing. And when you pass the accessibility testing, then you are golden, that you don't have to worry about any lawsuits because you have taken care of the needs. So what is Section 508 we saw in the earlier slide? It's the amendment to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And this one is targeted to the websites. And it has been recently updated in 2017. But these are federal government websites that are developed, like cdc.gov or healthcare.gov or anything right now, which is a .gov, has to be accessible by all people with all levels of disabilities. So that means federal government never rolls out a website without making sure it is accessible for all of them. And it is not only for the federal government, but people who are going to be able to work with the federal government, like contractors or vendors for federal government. Their websites and their applications, everything has to be accessible. And you can find more information on section 508.gov. So federal government, if they are trying to analyze few vendors for some products and services, and one of them has great features and functionality, but they don't have accessibility certifications and they don't have in-depth knowledge on accessibility. However, the second competitor has the in-depth knowledge on accessibility, but they don't have so much features and functionality. They are going to choose the one second, even though they might be expensive or less expensive. It doesn't matter for them. It matters for them to be able to get all the functionality that they are trying to build for the website, and they are trying to also make sure accessibility is taken care of. So web content accessibility guidelines, they have been published in 2018. The 2.1 has been published in 2018, but has been there for 20 years or so. it came around 97 or 98-ish when the internet came around. But the main concept of web accessibility guidelines are these 4 basic principles. The first principle is anything that has been built or developed should be perceivable. Anything that has been built or developed should be operable, understandable, and robust. So following these 4 basic principles, it goes into the details. We'll get into the details of how many criteria are there and how many guidelines are there in the next few slides. But learning that these are the 4 basic principles, and there are 3 basic levels. So the levels of conformance are level A, which is the most basic conformance. Let's say your website, you have e-commerce on a website, and now you have most basic conformance, then you still do not meet the laws, required laws, because it is basic. It is not meeting all the required guidelines. So the next level is level AA. So when you have level A, you are still failing. So somebody can sue your company or an organization, and it will that person is going to win the case because you just have level A. And if that person has found challenges on your website, then that person is going to surely win the case. Most likely, let's say, instead of surely. So the next level is level AA, which is the biggest and most common barriers. All these barriers are now overcome with this level of conformance. That means if you take the first level as 30% meeting the guidelines, the barrier, the level AA is 70%. So government is very generous enough that it will let your website or products or services pass with the 70%. And the last one is the highest level of accessibility, which is like 95 to 100%. So whatever you have is completely accessible, which is the highest level, right? So, which is a fair law according to the laws. However, if these have been completely neglected when something has been built from the ground up with the websites or e-commerce or anything, the organization could be under severe risk when somebody who has disabilities try to access and then they figure out there have been challenges, they could easily go to the court. So the way it is structured is the guidelines and success criteria. As you can see over here, this is how the web content accessibility guidelines are structured. The guidelines, the success criteria, and the techniques to achieve them. And then there is detailed references for people to understand, and people can go and read about these detailed references. And then the developers have been given detailed guidelines to what needs to be done. And we are going to go over them in the future slides. So basically understanding that there's principles that are divided into guidelines, and these guidelines are divided into success criteria. And these are the kind of a standard way of meeting this. So last slide was WCAG 2.0 version, and 2.1 follows the similar structure of guidelines, success criteria, and principles. However, there are newer features are requested to be enabled for websites, mobile websites, and other things, or mobile apps. So there is a newer structure or newer guidelines that have been asked to be given. So we talked about these 4 principles in the previous slide: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Every guideline is with that. So we have to come to make sure that every guideline is going to be able to follow these principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And there are 13 guidelines. If we have to go over each guideline, it will take each one an hour or more than that. So we are not going to go over each of the guidelines, but we'll see one or two samples of a level A, level AAA. But what I'm going to do is give you the depth and breadth of what it is. So there are 78 criteria, there are 13 guidelines, and there are 4 principles. So following these 78 criteria and 13 guidelines will make your application almost 95 to 100%ish, where it is completely AAA guidelines according to the law. So you are going to be one of the examples in the industry when you follow all of these and implement. And as we said, level AA will allow you to just follow 70% of it and then meet the most common barriers. So this is the breadth. The breadth is 13 guidelines. The depth is 78 criteria. And you can assume that on an average for each guideline, there are 6 criteria. So 13 multiplied by 6 would average give 6 criteria for each guideline. So it is not an exhaustive, it's not a huge rocket science to understand accessibility guidelines. And once you start working on it, you will feel more and more comfortable. So let's look at some of the criteria right now. So the level A, 1.1.1. This is like how many levels deep it goes, right? Level A and first guideline, and this is the first of the most important guideline, right? But it can be easily met. What it says is all non-text content should have an alternative way to access the non-text content, right? Which will serve the equivalent purpose. So that means, for example, text alternatives for all your images. So let's say you have a beautiful beach image as your article's image. But if you don't describe that image, a person using a screen reader cannot understand. It will say image. But if on that image you said a beautiful beach or something like that, and that would be your heading of your article, then the person is completely missing the heading because your image has a beautiful beach, and then it cannot be read out by the screen reader. So the best way to do is give an alt tag and give that an alternative text and say it's a beautiful beach. That's the title of this page or something. And text alternative to audio and video content, right? So let's say you have people who have disability with ears, they cannot hear much. So if you have a text alternative, they can at least read the text. And low hearing, hearing disability, complete dumb, and those kind of, or deaf, that could be taken care of by giving alternative text. And then a name to controls such as search or submit, those are some of the important criteria. Let's say, rather than saying button, neck, like something like that. If you have a search and you don't have, you just have an icon for search, then users will not know unless you give it a name called search, right? And submit. So that was level A. So let's look at level AA. So I'm going to go one example in each. So this example, it's saying orientation on portrait or landscape. The content should not restrict a user to use either portrait only portrait or only landscape. The user should be able to use it in both ways if they would like to use it. So that means online video sites or content and everything, right? Most of the time we prefer to use landscape, and if the website doesn't allow, or web application or mobile application doesn't allow landscape, then the content is always shrunk, and it doesn't necessarily lend itself in a portrait view. So that's one of the level AA, where the orientation needs to be met. Same thing with messaging websites or email or something like that. Anything should be able to do in especially messaging right here. This is again an example of it. So users should be able to use it in the landscape or portrait, and then they can be able to navigate or do whatever functionality they are trying to do after sending. Then the level AA, which is kind of an e-reader app, right? Or you can imagine as Kindle or something else or anything. So users should be able to use both ways, portrait and landscape, whatever they would like to be doing in whichever view. So that's level AA. And let's look at the level AAA, right? Level AAA, and this is the guideline, or this is 2.5.5, right? It talks about the target size of a button or something like that, which a target size should be a minimum of 44 by 44 pixels, right? So the reason why they would like to have this is people who are having some challenges with, let's say, cerebral palsy or shaky hands or something like that. Having a bigger button will help them easily click that rather than having a smaller button, right? Here are the examples of a 44 pixel button, right? And with a large UI text versus a large, it's almost like an extra large button. And we have been used to seeing these days, almost all of the websites are using large buttons, large text boxes, large drop downs, and probably this is one of the reasons, is to make them easier to be clickable, noticeable, and doing. So if you go with a smaller button, which is like 24 pixels, it's going to be very challenging for people with disabilities and impairments to be able to select that button or click that button. Yep. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the questions comment section, and then Catherine will read out as she mentioned earlier. So we talked about that button, right? So they have come up with more easier examples to understand and why they are asking these guidelines to be taken care of. So they have modified, instead of cut and dry standards, they have given something like this, right? They say a retiree who has a hand tremor needs a big buttons or big who and has a big button fingers. The buttons are so small, and because of the tremor, they are hitting a cancel button instead of a submit button. And it becomes a challenge for them where they have filled up all of the form, and suddenly the button, by accidentally clicking the cancel button, the entire form has been removed, right? So they cancel. So they have to fill up all the form again, right? So this is where it is much more needed to have these big buttons. So when you have the big buttons, right, they really appreciate the big buttons, and it doesn't bother people with normal vision, everything, people who have normal conditions, who doesn't have any physical disabilities or any other cognitive disabilities. For them, it doesn't matter if the button is big or small, but it does matter a lot for people like me, who are visually low visual person, and people who have tremors in their hands, and people with cerebral palsy, and so many other people with disabilities. So that is one of the reasons that it is very much needed to take care of these minimum criteria that will help. And when you meet this criteria, it's like level AAA, right? So I bet your mouse pointer is not so big compared to my mouse pointer, right? And for me, this one works much easier. For you, you don't need it, but you don't mind me having this because it will probably, it is a preference. It's a matter of preference. So the buttons, when you're using on websites or anything, you are just using it for temporary sake. So that's why people with normal vision, normal non-disabled people will not mind for a few minutes of using an application and using a website because it's not going to bother them that much. But that's one of the reasons this is a win-win-win situation for everybody, that it will help for a lot of sales. It will help for expanding the base of the clients. If you have products and services that are serving people who have disabilities and other things, then you are increasing the market share. Then it also doesn't bother the normal people, but also it helps people with disabilities. So there's a win-win-win situation for everybody by doing by taking care of the guidelines. So here is an example of text spacing in, again, level AA. It talks about having a 1.5x font size, and it talks about 2x font spacing between the paragraphs, and the label spacing having. So this will all enhance the readability, and it will help people with disabled also to read faster, easier than compared to people with normal abilities. So here is a code level example. So when you take relative EMS, relative measuring to, so giving a font size of a RAM is much better than giving a font size of 18 pixels as a standard text size. And then you give the line height and then the spacing 0.12 RAMs. And this one is much, much better website accessibility meeting guidelines versus something that is pixelated that will not scale as much as a RAM. So here is a website where you can find guidelines for web content accessibility. So it's WCAG 2.1. If you don't remember anything, just remember WCAG, WCAG 2.1, and in Google, you'll find this very easily. And here is a long list of what the guidelines are and how to meet those criteria. So let's look at the developer way of how these guidelines help a user, right? So if you have familiarity with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is used to develop the websites all over. So what happens is when a website is developed, it creates something called, with the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it creates something called a DOM tree. DOM, of course, most of the developers might be familiar with it. It's a document object model. But at the same time, it also creates something called accessibility tree. And this accessibility tree is what assistive technologies plug in to let a blind user or to let a user with disabilities let them know about what's happening on the application. So the DOM produces the HTML, CSS, and a nice web application, websites, web pages, mobile apps, or anything. Versus accessibility is not bothered about how the presentation of the websites look. It is more bothered about, does the website buttons have text like search, submit, or something like that? Does the website images have alternative text that the assistive technologies can take and read it to the user? So that's what the role of the accessibility tree is. So let's break all this high level down into the detail level. So we talked about the DOM tree and accessibility tree, right? So let's start looking at some code examples that will allow us to understand accessibility tree a little more deeper than, because I'm not going to spend too much time on the DOM because I'm assuming you are much familiar with the DOM and everything. If you're unfamiliar of HTML, there are a lot of courses on the public internet that you could go to, let's say w3cschools.com, and that has courses for HTML. But this course assumes that you have understanding of HTML. So when you have this HTML on the left side, as you can see, there is title, which is much easier for an accessibility tree to say based on this title. And then you have a label for, so that's very good that it has, it is an input type of text and there is a label for it. So the accessibility will take care of this. And then there is button for back and front. So this is HTML, and when you do SQL on the HTML, you can see the DOM tree that is being constructed. But here is the accessibility tree that is constructed based on this HTML, right? And this is what the assistive technology is trying to read out to the, give that information out to the user, so that the user can make sense of what is presented in front of them, if it is a blind user or low vision user like me. So here it says the role of web area, and it's because it's a title. The title can be long multi-text. That's why the role is given as web area, and it said how old are you? So the user is going to hear that role web area, how old are you, then, or the name of the button, how old are you, so they can easily hear that message. And they say, then the label will say age text field, right? The text field or something like that. And then the value, if you have given 42, then it will take the value of 42 and send it to the back. Then it will say there is button, back, and button next. So this is how the accessibility tree is constructed, and based on the role and the name, most of the transactions that the assistive technology needs is constructed in the accessibility tree. So here, let's look at a programmatic semantics example, right? So here is the preferred aisle seat. Here is the label for the, let's assume this is a website that somebody is trying to book a ticket. And when they are booking a ticket, they have an option to take different seats, right? Window seat, aisle seat, or no preference. So these are different options in the select dropdown. So since this has been using semantic HTML5 semantics like select and labels, it is very good that it is using that, because it gives automatically role. So it gives the name combo box. So when the assistive technology comes over here, it says status is collapsed. And then by default, if you, let's say, if it's collapsed and no preference and the user selects aisle seats, it will say the preferred aisle seat type. So it will take the name of the label, or like the label content, and will say it as a name for the drop-down box, so which is the combo box. So now the user will hear that role combo box name, preferred seat type, state collapsed, or when you click on it, it will expand. It will say expanded. State will be collapsed or expanded. Value, aisle seat, if you have selected aisle seat. So this is how the assistive technology will transcribe all this information so that the screen readers or anything can take that information and make it much easier to understand for people. Any questions so far? Next. Now, implicit semantics. So these implicit semantics are sometimes like we need to have like for a button it is implicit semantic, but if you use some elements or UI components that are very rich and that sometimes don't follow the semantics, then it will be very challenging. So that's why using semantical elements like combo boxes, text boxes, buttons are much better because they have those rich semantics for free. That means here we didn't have to tell in this, because it's a select, it automatically did the roles as combo box. And once it know that it's a type of an input element, then it looked for the label and then it gave it the label as the name for the combo box. So this based on label for based on the name, it could easily decipher that information in the HTML for the accessibility tree to be constructed. And then that could be easily used. So let's look at this. Click me is a button, and when you use a button, then it will say button click me, because that's the name of the button or the value of the button. Then there is a text box, which is a text field, and the screen reader will tell that, right? So same thing with the combo box, as we have seen earlier example, combo box, and you can change I'll seat versus no preference, window seat, whatever it is, right? And you are getting all this for free without having to code extra. But once you use some rich components, if they are not having built-in semantics, rich semantics, then you would have to code for them. And we'll look at that in the later stage. Landmarks. So landmarks are really necessary for people who are trying to understand information on very big websites like Microsoft, developer networks, or Amazon, trying to navigate the millions of products that they sell, right? If there are no landmarks, then the user will have to navigate through the navigation menu, which will be in 50, 70 clicks. And then not just, it's very challenging if there is no landmarks. It doesn't allow you to skip the content. You have to go through the content step by step, and to skip to the content to almost to the bottom, you would have to traverse from the top to the bottom. However, landmarks are a very good technique which will allow users to skip. Let's say there are different levels of headers in HTML5 or HTML. You have H1 to H6, different levels of heading. And then you have main content, then you have navigation, nav content, there is footer and other sections. All these, when you do tab over, tab up, tab over, then you can easily skip from heading to a main to the navigation to footer, rather than having to go through everything on the main, footer, navigation, and header, etc. So let's look at this example. This example is a button looking, but it's not a button. A div element has been used to look, and it has been styled to look like a button, a sign up button over here. It has been nicely given a shadow. It has been given the shape of a button with a nice rounded corner. And for a regular user, they have no issue at all by clicking on this, because they know they see it is as a button, but the developer has used the div tag And this div tag has a click action, click handler in the behind the scenes, and that click handler takes care of the functionality of signing up, right? Sign up. However, the assistive technologies will fail understanding what this image, what this button is. And hence, if the assistive technology fails, then your website is failing. And if your website is failing, your website is open for lawsuits. And that could be very costly and very, very challenging. So the better way to do is make sure, if you have to use the div, then we use something called ARIA, which we'll talk in the later stage, to make it a little bit easier to understand for the assistive technology, hence making it easier to understand for people with disabilities. So here, the assistive technology is going to read up as sign up group, but it's not a group. Div is a group element because it can group multiple elements like text boxes, drop downs, text areas, whatever it is, right? Labels and everything. Div is that a group element. That's why the assistive technology reads it as a group. But if it were a button over here, then it would have said sign up button, which would have been much more easier for a assistive technology, and it passes the accessibility test for this button. So as we've been already talking about, what ARIA is an alternative way of making applications which are rich internet applications accessible. That means accessible rich internet applications ARIA. And it's a specification given by Web Accessibility Initiative. So knowing that not everybody is going to stick with HTML5 or HTML4 elements, that they have said, okay, if you have to do this, you could use something called ARIA, which will give you an ability to modify and enhance the semantic meaning of the HTML elements right down, right? So here is the div tag, and ARIA will let you modify the meaning, semantic meaning. The semantic meaning of here right now is a group, and if you have to change it to a button from a group, then ARIA is going to help us. Semantic meaning without it doesn't modify the functionality, right? So as it says, it doesn't change the behavior or the functionality by using ARIA. So how does ARIA work or look like? ARIA is like still a band-aid. It is not a great, but at least it works, right? It will stop the bleeding. If not, it will be bleeding because people with disabilities will not be able to use it. So where does ARIA sit? We talked about the accessibility tree that has been generated along with the DOM tree, right? So DOM tree is generated, and immediately in few milliseconds, accessibility tree is generated. But what does ARIA do is, where does it step in? It steps in right over here. What it does is it will take your DOM elements, and it will, once it sees that there are ARIA labels and ARIA label by or something like that is added, then it will modify the DOM element to, or at least give the information to the accessibility tree that instead of a group, it will say it is a button or something like that. So hopefully this makes sense, and we'll see some examples of ARIA now. So before we look into the examples of ARIA, there is a vast amount of documentation that is available, right? And W3C schools, right? As you can see, ARIA-guide. This is a very easy to remember bit.ly. We all know bit.ly, shortening of URLs, bit.ly-aria-guide. And it will give you the ARIA authoring process, right? So how you should enhance your code so that the code gets translated, transcribed, so that it could be easily understood by the assistive technologies by helping the accessibility tree generation. So if you look at an example of a checkbox, this is what ARIA gives as guidance, right? All this documentation, if you're having trouble sleeping, you can just take up any of these accessibility documentation, start reading, you will have no problem falling asleep. So that's how much information is available. This is one of my efforts in this accessibility presentation, is to help understand information better, so you could easily access the information where it is available in the internet, and then you can apply that in your products and services. So labels helps users understand the purpose of the control, right? So in the previous example, if there is no labels, which we have seen, then it's very difficult for accessibility tree to show or tell the information that it is a button or it is a text or something. So that's the reason why ARIA label is very easy to use, and you can just give a string and that will override the native labeling mechanism. So let's say you had a label before this and that label said XYZ, and you gave an ARIA label main menu, then that label XYZ is overridden by this button main menu. So it gives that native functionality of that. So if you didn't have the label, so let's say you could completely take away the label out and you can just say ARIA-label main menu, and the idea of this is hamburger. So what did this do? It gives that, it already knows that it is a button. It knows that it is a button, and then it gives the label, ARIA label, as main menu, and it says main menu button. So that's how it makes, ARIA makes the modifications, as we have seen in this diagram. It has made the modification so that the accessibility tree could access what it is with the label tag. Without having the label tag, you could still, the accessibility tree could know that it is main menu and it is button. And assistive technology will hear it like this, main menu button. So they can, as soon as they come over here. Looks like there is a question. Catherine, do you want to read out the question?
Actually, it was Elaine who seemed to really enjoy your joke about reading the documentation to fall asleep.
Okay, that is. I thought that was serious, but it is a joke too. And there's so much of amount of material, and even if you try to understand some of it and try to put into practice some of them, it is much better than actually not doing anything, because this is going to make your organization's products and services much better. So here, ARIA label by is another way of giving multiple scenarios. So even though it's like a band-aid, but it also helps developers reduce the number of elements that they are creating, but also it helps with making the experience of everybody much easier, the people with disabilities and people with abilities. So this again overrides the existing ARIA label. So this is higher in the precedence. That means label by will be highest, then label is the ARIA label is next, and then the regular label. So the label by allows you to chain, like how jQuery allows you to chain multiple things. So you can say label LBL and BNT. So now, just by doing this, what accessibility tree is going to know that the shop now is not just a button. It is going to say that it's men outerwear shop now button. So outerwear shop now button is constructed by taking LBL, which is this ID, men's outerwear, and then taking the BTN, which is again this ID, its own self, and it's shop now. And then it took the button. So now it's men's outerwear shop now button. That's how the accessibility tree understands it. So next, if you haven't seen Chrome has developer tools, especially accessibility. If you haven't seen the accessibility tab, it is under the Chrome F12. You go into the elements and then you go into the accessibility tab. You will see accessibility tree. And here, this is what we've been talking about, the accessibility tree, how it looks like in a developer tools called in the Chrome. So here, if you see an example of, until now we have been either seeing the code or we have been seeing this and this, but now here we can see end to end how a checkbox, that's a big checkbox, looks like sign up. And this has been constructed by using a div tag, and that div tag is using ARIA label by and saying sign up, right? So once you have that, the way the accessibility tree is taking this div and it said a class of checkbox, but that is a CSS class, right? And role of a checkbox. So once you gave the role of a checkbox, an ARIA label, and ARIA checked, so all this, it made it like almost like it's almost a checkbox for the assistive technology. So that's why it says role of a checkbox, but actually it is a div tag. It is not a real checkbox, but it doesn't matter for it. Now that these ARIA labels and role help it to make meaning for that div tag. So it will say checkbox and it says checked true. So as you can see over here, checked true. Over here, ARIA checked true. And then the user can toggle on and off. And it also gave the name sign up. Perfect. So now this is how assistive technology is reading it. Sign up, checked, checkbox. And when you click on the space bar, then it will say sign up, unchecked, checkbox. So that's how they can use only keyboards or mouse, something like that. And then the screen readers will be able to tell what it is. Yeah. So that's, yeah. So that's screen reader navigation. So how everything works, right? So there are different technologies we've been using for technical authoring technology or development is HTML. We have looked at ARIA now, rich internet applications, accessible rich internet applications, scalable vector graphics, cascading style sheet, security assumption, markup language. And so we have all of these technologies. On top of this, we have been looking at WCAG, which is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And there are guidelines for assistive technologies too. So they have standardized for assistive technologies. It's called Assistive Technology Accessibility Guidelines, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And then this is user agent accessibility guidelines. So all these accessibility guidelines that are assistive technologies or screen readers or any others like JAWS or NVIDIA, NVAccess, there's so many assistive technologies out there, Zoom text and different assistive technologies. And user agents, there are so many user agents that are like Chrome, Edge, Internet Explorer, Firefox, etc. So all of these sit in here and developers use this and the guidelines to develop and author the tools, right? And the QA people will evaluate if it is accessible or not. And then you will be able to fix accessibility defects and something like that. Then the users. So this is the developer side of the area, and this is the user side of the area. They are using the browsers, and then they're using assistive technologies, which will plug in between the browser and the user and decipher the information that has been given on the user interface so that the users will be able to absorb all that information and make correct actions for them. So this is whatever I've covered until now is existing in the software industry, software engineering industry. And what the couple slides, I have a proposal for the software engineering industry, but it will take time to get there. So until now, these are some of the main disciplines of software engineering, which is architecture, business analysts, product owners, product managers, whatever it is. Then the development teams, which will have developers, front end, back end, full stack, whatever. And then user experience designers, researchers, UX analysts, UX professionals, usability analysts, whatever role you want to take, but categorizing them into these buckets. Then quality assurance, manual, automated, then load and performance testing. There's so many, these 6 buckets. Once we have this, I say that this accessibility, it's time to promote it to its own field, because it's no longer, if you talk to a UX designer, they will say it's a sub-discipline, which I disagree. And accessibility should be its own discipline. It's no longer, it's its own discipline inside of software engineering, or it could be, so that it needs to, it has breadth and depth. It is a cross-cutting discipline. It goes into user experience, development, business analyst, architecture, QA, and everything. So it's a cross-cutting discipline, and it should be its own. So when we do this accessibility discipline, and I really believe if all of the companies in the world starts to do accessibility, take that seriously, and if somehow it is funded or tax credits for that or government funding for that, then there will be millions of jobs created all over the world for accessibility. And I would like to see this day coming soon, where so many jobs are getting created for accessibility. And what kind of jobs I'm talking about? There could be accessibility architect. I'm kind of accessibility architect. So then there is business analysts who are accessibility, who learns all the requirements and who can expand the products and services with those kind of knowledge, product owner knowledge. And then the developers like you guys, you have learned in depth of all these 78 criteria. And these could be growing more and more in the newer versions of the guidelines coming out. So then accessibility designers who are making sure that it is taken care of, accessibility is taken care of. So like that, automation engineers. Now, most of the companies who do accessibility for living, there are companies that have products for accessibility, accessibility development products, accessibility testing products, and other things. So, and there are companies that specialize in accessibility remediation and guidance, and not only guidance, consulting. So they go through the assessment of existing application. They'll come up with what are the remediation needs, and then they'll come read what are the remediation, because there are a lot of violations, and one violation
Harish, I think we're
have been
losing you.
identified. I think probably it is the headphones. Let me, are you able to hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yep.
Okay. So the accessibility statement, when displayed on a site like CNN.com, Fox, or anything, they have some level of an accessibility statement. They tell how much of their website is accessible, and they will give the guidance or number for people who are having challenges that they could call, or they will provide alternative ways of information for them. So this is very good to have. It's not very good, it's great to have. It's and then if your organization is going for government contracts, then this is like mandatory to have. So it's always also, it is good business. So you can expand business for your organization by 20% to 25% when you have accessibility included in your products and services. So then here's an example of an accessibility statement, how it can be generated, and it is available. And these cannot be generated by anybody. Somebody who has tested accessibility, who has certified, they have to be generating this. So in conclusion, I think the action items that we have are, we advocate for accessibility compliance inside of our organization and outside of our organizations, so people can start leveraging the techniques, the standards and the guidelines, and make web accessible for everybody, because it is not fair for people who have disabilities. They cannot use web e-commerce or web applications where, especially in times of COVID-19, it is almost everything is going digital, and they are at a loss. They are already having challenges to go to a store and get something for themselves, and now they are at a huge loss when your websites, our websites, are not making it accessible friendly. So it helps also if you have clients, you can advocate and tell them about the accessibility needs and move into that area. And say for public sites and applications, it's almost like needed. It's not nice to have. And learn more details in accessibility. This was just a surface. We only looked at 3 guidelines. There are 13 guidelines and 78 criteria. So there's many more criteria to look at. And implement on the projects, and proactively implementing, it will take 10 image code and all. Then
We're starting to lose audio again.
Okay. Give me 1 second.
Hello?
We can hear you again.
Okay. Where did we lose? I think my headphones had
I think it might
dried up. So did you
I
guys
think
hear?
with the everyone using Wi-Fi and internet, I think it's also probably hitting that bandwidth at the moment. So that could be part of the problem for us.
Okay. So I think there were like a few texts or in the chat, if you want to.
Yep, Elaine did have one question. She wrote,
Okay.
I have a specific question on a project I am working on. I am remediating a website built in a builder, and Axe says there is a double roll of banner on one page.
Okay. So that is when you're using a tool like Axe, or that is somehow not, probably it is taking the HTML, the DOM, it is recreating into a confused state of DOM. So the accessibility tree is getting confused or something, right? So if there is double banner and you have verified there's no multiple pages, that doesn't repeat any banner. So you have to look into probably the DOM, and then also look into the accessibility tree if you are trying to use with a screen reader or even with that. So unless we go into the details of the code, it will be challenging to understand where exactly the problem might be. I could just high-level guide, which could be in the DOM. Once you see where it is not rendering it correctly. And if you like, we can take offline, and then we can chat about it a little later. Yep. Any other question?
No other questions so far. It does look like she's excited about the idea of chatting offline afterwards.
Sure, sounds great. So
And let me just, no questions on the YouTube live, so it looks like we're good for questions.
okay, so here is where we said is to advocate for accessibility and helping clients implement accessibility, which is going to be good business because you are helping them protect themselves from legal challenges. And it's also a business for your organization if your organization is serving those clients with development needs. And learning is always, learning never ends until our last breath. So, and implementing this on your projects is going to be getting you more valuable in the marketplace, getting more credibility with your clients, and then sharing with the team members and knowledge with anybody. It doesn't matter who you are sharing, as long as you are sharing this knowledge and making others come into your level of understanding of, hey, let's try to make this code review. So when you are doing code reviews in the projects, let's say if somebody is missing alt tags and other things, can we just code it so we don't have to go back to coding it again, because it will take few seconds or few minutes to do it right from the gate. As if you have remembered, my first one of the first few slides where accessibility ramp, it was done after the fact. So after the fact, you can still do it, but it is much better. It's very cheap to do it upfront rather than doing after the fact. And then it is a potential source of revenue for your organization and expanding the business, as we have talked a few times earlier. So that brings to the conclusion. Any questions and answers?
Yep, if anyone has any last minute questions, please let us know. Harish, while we're waiting to see if anyone does, thank you so much for this. I always appreciate when you're willing to give up some time for us. So thank you again for a wonderful presentation. All right, so any last minute questions? Looks like, nope, looks like we've gotten some thank yous, responses.
Sure,
So,
you're welcome. And thank you so much, SDG and Catherine. And thank you all for listening in today. I appreciate it. Thank you.
okay, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the live.